Good evening. Welcome to today's session, The Commitments of Anticolonialism, Impossible and Necessary Projects, which is a part of Orient Black Swan's discussion series. We will be joined by Professor Ajay Skaria and Professor Shruti Kapila, who will be in conversation with Dr. J. Daniel Ilam. Thank you all for joining us. Most South Asian anti-colonialism envisioned not merely national independence, but rather endeavored to imagine a world after colonialism. This world required new political philosophies, methods of critique, and new collectivities. Most thinkers, notably Gandhi, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, and Lala Hardayal, understood that the post-colonial world they sought was unlikely to be achieved in their lifetimes, even if they lived to see Indian independence in 1947. Anti-colonialism was therefore an impossible and necessary project. Starting with Dr. Ilam's recent book, Impossible and Necessary, this discussion will take up the global commitments of South Asian anti-colonialism at the beginning of the 20th century: equality, violence, critique, sovereignty, and egalitarianism. I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Professor Ajay Skaria studied political science for his bachelor's and medieval history for his master's at Maharaja Sayaji Rao University, Baroda, during which period he also worked as a journalist for the Indian Express. He received his PhD in history from Trinity College, Cambridge, and currently teaches at the University of Minnesota. A member of the Subaltern Studies editorial collective from 1995 till its dissolution, he is one of the co-editors of Subaltern Studies Volume 12, the author of Hybrid Histories, Forests, Frontiers, and Wildness in Western India, and Unconditional Equality, Gandhi's Religion of Resistance. He is currently working on two books, What is Democratic Secularism? And On Political Friendship. Professor Shruti Kapila is a university lecturer in history and convener of the History and Politics Tripos at the University of Cambridge. Her principal field of scholarship and publications are modern and contemporary India and global political thought. She also researches and writes on the history of modern science and race, gender and political violence. Her latest work, Violent Fraternity in the Indian Age, received advanced praise as a groundbreaking book tipped to globalize the field of political thought, and will be published jointly by Princeton University Press and Penguin Random House in autumn 2021. Professor Kapila regularly engages in political commentary and opinion on India and global politics for the international media, including the Financial Times and Prospect magazine, and writes a fortnightly column for the print India. Dr. Daniel Ilam is the author of Impossible and Necessary and the co-editor of two volumes on revolutionary anti-colonial writing, Reading Revolutionaries with Kama McLean 2014 and Writing Revolution with Kama McLean and Chris Moffat in 2017. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Hong Kong. He was a fellow in the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University in 2018-19 and the Mellon Sawyer Seminar Postdoctoral Fellow in Bibliomigrancy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2015-16. We thank our panelists for joining us this evening, and our audience is welcome to put their questions in the question and answer box during the discussion. I would now like to invite Dr. Ilam to initiate the conversation with the following question. Why a re-evaluation of key anti-colonial figures such as Gandhi, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, and others now? What type of approaches are you taking that is different from previous work on these anti-colonial thinkers?
Thank you very much, Namita. Thank you, Orient Black Swan, for putting this together, and thank you everyone for showing up, and I look forward to the conversation. I'll kind of briefly, maybe perhaps give a short answer to this question and then pass it over to Ajay, who has thought more kind of robustly about this. But I mean, I would say this question in its form, almost precisely in its form, is a question that Simona Sani asked at the Madison conference on South Asia in 2012, when a panel of us were working on Bhagat Singh and thinking about revolutionary thought. And so I think there's something about the teens and now 20s that invite a comparison with an earlier moment of revolutionary thought in the face of violence and global imperialism. And I think rethinking this moment, but from a position of not non-authority or non-majorityness, is now, I think, one of the kind of main things that is pushing the field in this direction. I would like to think so, at least. And in one of the kind of major commitments, I think, of reevaluating anti-colonialism, especially kind of revolutionary anti-colonialism now, is to kind of reimagine what might be salvageable, what might be recuperable, what might be rethinkable, what might be valuable for thinking about egalitarian politics. Not simply in the 1920s and 1930s with Gandhi and Ambedkar and Bhagat Singh, but also for the contemporary moment. This is part of a longer trajectory, which I'll ask Ajay to give a sketch of. Your mic is off.
Okay, first of all, thanks so much for this invitation. It's wonderful to be here with this group, and it was a pleasure to read Daniel's book closely. You know, I've been looking forward to this, so this was a wonderful opportunity to do that. And I want to say, I think I would say that what is distinctive is the current focus on these anti-colonial thinkers is that we have come to recognize them as thinkers of the minor, or at least we have come to place their thinking in relationship to the question of the minor. To get to what I mean by this, I think it helps to distinguish between four moments in the writing of the history of modern India. The first three have been quite thoroughly described, so I'll not spend too much time on them. There's the nationalist movement, which remained a significant strand in its more quote-unquote progressive forms, all the way down to Bipin Chandra, and which celebrated independence as the beginning of an emancipated society. Then there is the more critical Marxist and leftist tradition, which continues to be extraordinarily important and valuable, right? And we stress the way that the way in which post-independence India was marked by the dominance of a subcontinental elite, and which found its telos in seeking a different kind of state. Right? So I think what these first two moments share, despite the enormous difference between them, is what could be called a statist hope, right? A hope for transforming the Indian state itself and for placing the Indian state at the vanguard of whatever kind of social change was to be brought about. And then from around the 80s, as the statist hope fades, there emerges the early moment of subaltern studies, which is critical of statism itself as an orientation. In that early moment, the emphasis is on a separate domain of subaltern activity, an activity that resists incorporation into the nationalist narrative, that escapes the nationalist narrative. This is also the moment of the focus on power, on domination, etc. Now, what I'm calling the fourth moment could be described as an intensification of the subaltern critique of statism. The form that this intensification takes is that of inflecting the concept, not rejecting, inflecting the concept of the subaltern with that of the minor. Like every conceptual order, of course, the concept of the minor hardly works by itself. It works along with other concepts. right? It brings along with it several other concepts. Those of minority, those of majority, those of major, these are the most evident ones. But then there's also the concept of recognition, the concept of the enemy, that of civil war, that of the impossible, etc. And now, of course, many of these concepts have been around for a long time. There's nothing necessarily new in each of these concepts as themselves, right? But what the concept of the minor in its redeployment manages to accomplish is to really serve as a powerful quilting point, a point that transforms them internally and also brings them together in an especially illuminating way, right? And I would say that you see this concept of the minor and its associated galaxy in the work of a lot of scholars, right? Of roughly my generation and younger and all of that, and some older also, I think of Simona Sani, Anu Rao, Faisal Devji, Uday Kumar, Leela Gandhi, Gopal Guru, and of course, this panel of me, Shruti, and Daniel. In fact, I would say Daniel's book is a particularly brilliant uptake of the concept of the minor and its associates. Before I just want to say one more thing, which is to say that we have to how to distinguish the concept of the minor from that of the subaltern. And I think one way of saying this is that as a concept, the subaltern names those who find themselves denied equality, perhaps so disempowered as to be unable to claim equality. Subalternity, in other words, is morally wrong, something that calls for immediate redress. By contrast, the minor is a moral principle. Minor is not quite the same as minority or minors. Minorities usually refer to enumerated and identifiable groups, which are usually in a subordinate position in a polity. Minors refers to all those who do not have the power to act as citizens or full legal subjects. Legally, one may think these are only children, but don't forget the moron, the Kerala High Court judge, who insisted that a 24-year-old woman was not adult enough to marry, right? In talking of the minor, I want to include these two senses, but I also want to get to what underlies both of them, the sense of embodying practices, beliefs, or even a way of being that is at odds with the norms of society. And it is because the affirmation of, the minor in this sense is a core principle of any democratic politics that I'm calling the minor a moral principle, right? An ethical principle. The moral and ethical, of course, not exactly identical, but for now, I'll just use them interchangeably. The minor are those who are not dominant, but claim equality without abandoning their minor status. And I think one striking example that we can think of this right away is the LGBTQ movement, right? In other words, the minor is not a majority in waiting, right? And equality, to be democratic, must abide by the principle of the minor. And this politics that abides by the principle of the minor is what we call a minoritarian politics. Okay. Now, what makes Daniel's book so timely and important is that it's a very subtle and nuanced approach, exploration of minoritarian politics by these four figures, right? So that's one part of the question. The second part of the question, which is why now? Why a revaluation of these key figures now? I think you can already see from the description that I've given of the concept of minor as a concept, why it should be now. Socially, a range of developments are enabling the proliferation of spaces for the minor. If you think of Dalit mobilizations, if you think of the transformation of movements for gender equality, if you think of LGBTQ movements, and so on. But on the other hand, other developments, both institutional and social, are also fueling the rise of a new majoritarianism. On the cusp of these two developments, the minor is arguably more visible today, and by extension more visible as a principle in the past than it was earlier. And I do suspect that this has a lot to do with the emphasis on the minor. I also want to say something specifically about the registers on which Daniel's book activates the concept of the minor and the implications of this. Right? And I think I'll just, since I've already spoken for around 7 minutes, I'll just be very quick and identify 3 points. Maybe I won't even have time for 3, but at least 2 I'll do. One is the affirmation of critique in a different spirit. The affirmation of critique in the spirit of the minor. We often associate critique with Kant, and rightly so. But in doing so, we sometimes run the risk of forgetting that there has been another tradition of critique, right, which has, a very complex genealogy, but which has been very critical of Kant. This tradition is represented by many, many people, as I said, and those whom Daniel invokes most emphatically are Walter Benjamin and Frantz Fanon. So rather than saying critique has run out of steam, as some more sloppy and simplistic thinkers have been tempted to, Daniel very clearly wants to practice a critique in the spirit of the minor. And as Daniel notes, the spirit of the minor, the critique in the spirit of the minor, is driven by the spirit of unknowing, the spirit of the unrecognizable, right? Whereas by contrast, the expert seeks to know, to recognize secrets, etc., etc. And what Daniel does is interpret these 4 thinkers in that spirit. The manifestation of the other spirit, the other sense of the minor, is a trope that Daniel's book foregrounds: reading. What makes reading so important here is that reading involves, as he puts it, a disavowal of authorial mastery. To read is to become affected by others. Thus, across each of the 4 figures he deals with, Lala Hardayal, Ambedkar, Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, Daniel brings out how reading was central to them, how they refuse to speak of as experts, how they repeatedly assert their lack of expert knowledge, how they insist on their amateur status. Thus, Daniel's chapter on Ambedkar does not only note that Ambedkar was a voracious reader, but stresses that he was a reader who, quote unquote, read in ways that cannot be catalogued, and who moreover read in ways that undid the claims of the text authority, most famously, of course, the Manusmriti. I shall just quote this excellent passage from Daniel's book. I'm quoting now, between obeying Manu and burning Manu, we find the most radically egalitarian practice is reading Manu. Obeying Manu is a justification for continued authoritarian caste oppression. Burning Manu asserts authority over Manu, thereby gesturing towards perhaps caste equality, a value that is, as you've noted, necessary but insufficient. But when Ambedkar reads Manu closely, when Ambedkar critiques Manu, he reveals something more devastating to caste. Manu's authority, far from transcendent, is simply irrelevant. It is this final move that Ambedkar offers in the beginning of a model for the true annihilation of caste authority. Okay. There's a lot more actually that I wanted to say, but I've already gone on for quite a lot of time. So I'll stop here and turn it back to you, Daniel. But thank you again for this opportunity to read this wonderful book. So.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, the one of the kind of points that we discussed over email is a question that Shruti and I also have talked about for some time, which is a question of sovereignty, and the question of sovereignty as it relates to a question of minoritarian politics, and as it relates to a sort of type of way of thinking about anti-nationalism or anti-colonialism beyond nationalism. And yet somehow thinking also about questions of sovereignty, I should, to put it quite simply. And so I think I would like to kind of continue that conversation by asking Shruti to kind of speak about this relationship that you see between anti-colonialism and the forms of sovereignty and minoritarian politics, or the lack thereof.
No, thank you. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you again, Daniel, because of course we had an extended conversation. So I'll be brief, and delighted to also be in the same room as Ajay, whom I've not seen, but of course, so we've all been thinking in different ways about these figures and how we might reconstitute them for, either utopian or non-utopian ways. But, these figures have animated our worlds anew for some reason. And Ajay has pointed that out, and it's quite interesting just because I've just come out of some horrible television discussion. It's also interesting that these figures also stalk the Indian political landscape. So they're not dead, they're not archival figures that we are, as it were, bringing back into life. So I think that's it. I just wanted to make that a point. I wanted to, I said a lot of things in the long, I loved your book. It's very interesting, also especially interesting to me because you have a very different read and take on several of the figures that my book has worked with. And that also shows in a way how literature brings a very different register, a different set of interpretations into it. And so I'll just say a couple of things around that one of the things that I loved about your book was really how reading was written into it. And the practice of reading as central. On the question of sovereignty, I wanted to actually make only 2 points, which are more not so much about the impossible and the necessary, but a category, if I can have a wordplay, which I have really enjoyed, particularly looking at figures like, say, Hardayal, is between the possible and the actual. And the world of potentiality that it opens and not opens. So we cannot, so, if I think about Hardayal, whom I have, as we discussed earlier, I absolutely disliked his last book, which you loved, which is Hints for Self-Culture, and I was like, he was this incandescent writer, thinker who had disrupted his own life and left a huge kind of interrupted trace on the 20th century. And then he's written this really didactic book, on be a good subject, have fun. The injunction to have fun, is there. Break rules, but, so I just found it really interesting that, that what also happens from being a very active agent who is opening up, opening up a series of things, especially between two very important elements of modern life, i.e. the nation and the empire. And what he really does is, causes through his own personal disruption, really is also calling into question the strongest principles of the nation and empire. So it's not simply anti-colonialism. It is not simply something that will be statist or anti-statist, this recursive thing we find, and that's why historiographies are constantly trying to pull these people back into one tradition or another. So if you look at Hardayal, he can be he's servicing everything from radical diaspora to migration politics to, Sikh nationalism to everything, and communism too, the history of communism and the like. But if you actually look at the story that his story, and I think Ajay's point about embodied stuff is interesting here, that there's also a disruption, a very willful breakup of the subject. These are very Hardayal's is a very narcissistic politics. It kind of over-evaluates, in my view, the possibilities and the potential of the self. I've called his politics an egotopia in my book. So this is, this is, because it's really the self, and, and it's interesting. But having said so, what I think he does manage to do, unlike an Ambedkar or unlike, even Gandhi, is really force open, as I said, what is possible and what is not possible, or what can be actual. So the politics becomes very, almost fantastic. It's phantasmic in that sense. So it leaves a trace. It leaves a residue in several other ideologies, but will be ultimately recalcitrant to a normative project. And I think it's an incredibly disruptive politics that it produces. So I find that really, the most productive figure for very different reasons today to think about, and to actually resist the temptation of folding him into and settling him into nation or anti-colonialism or any particular ideology. So potentiality to me is the most interesting thing with someone like him. So I think that's, and I think the story of the self and question of sovereignty, and I'll conclude with that, is an interesting one because, of course, one of the features of early thoughts in particularly Gandhi, Hardayal too, but Tilak too, you can say a range of these people have bypassed the story of the state by actually making life and death individual properties, like really, in a way, reanimating. And, of course, Ajay's very wonderful phrase about, and for Faisal's phrase about killing without dying for Gandhi, or, surrender without subordination. These are really interesting phrases. But what is really at the stake of it all is, to me, is a kind of remaking of sovereignty, which is not the one which is going to end up or even begin with the state, but really is a project of the self, because life and death particularly is repurposed, reanimated, really remade as an individual possession. So sovereignty is no longer something that can be mediated upon via a third party. So it's not going to be about legitimacy. And I think this is why Ambedkar's project, and that's why I'd love for both of you to engage with some of when my book comes out. And Ambedkar's project is interesting because it is not a death politics. Despite it being interested in the caste question and the figure of the untouchable or the Dalit being the most abject subject, i.e., without sovereignty, without even the arms, it's been disarmed. Its depoliticization is really not simply an economic or story of labor, but it's a story of the Dalits' disarmament over time, right? And that's and then it's really interesting that it is Ambedkar who's really, if I can say, angry with the death politics, the potential of death politics, right? That this is what Gandhi has done. And it's not simply, it won't do to call him upper caste. This is just an upper caste story. It's actually a story about how a project of the political is then rethought, in which, Ambedkar will rescue politics for Indians, equality, whatever you want to call it, republicanism for me, which in a way rescues the story of India from this necropolitics, from this death politics, and without actually becoming a liberal, because the question of life and its enhancement is a liberal project. Its protection, its enhancement. So I see sovereignty in a way all over the 20th century, and not simply in the statist sense, but from, as it were, the egotopias of Hardayal to Gandhi's death politics to Ambedkar's refusal of death politics, and how do you kind of then? And so I think it's interesting. So your book has been incredibly productive, and I think it's also interesting for me, and I know it's a very unfashionable thing to say, but that to have two very different disciplinary visions into, or trainings into, the same figures. And that I thought was incredibly productive for me, that some of the ways you had read these figures were not I would not have gone down that route, and I think, and that does mean that, doing literature means something, versus doing history. But of course, I don't mean to kind of create disciplinary boundaries, but it has produced a different texture to these figures. So yeah, and I made a final point that I think I made, and I was trying to find my notes from my talk with your discussion, and I was thinking one of the interesting. So I, in fact, for the sake of some little bit of agonism here, some of let's have some debate here, So just the way, So I'm not a great fan of Fanon, as you know. So but what I find interesting about your book is the way it really centers him. And it also centers the other layer, which is the Jewish question, the minority question, the Benjamin. So it's very integrated. It's not something we are, having to choose between, or these are just kind of theoretical apparatuses that have just been deployed to make sense of India. So I find that fascinating, and I'd be curious to see how your book is taken up by those readers too, in terms of, whether the Indian story also can reflect the Jewish question in a different way. Let's put it like that, or the minority question in a different way, which doesn't necessarily have to return to the story of India and its struggle with minors of various varieties. So that is to say, does this world offer a new but unacknowledged universalized grammar of politics? So I'll leave it here.
Now, as I kind of formulate an answer from this, I might actually pass it over to Ajay to add his note on sovereignty. Thank you so much. That there's a lot to disagree with in all of the best, in the best way.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Ajay, you're on mute.
I was not clear. I mean, I didn't hear Daniel exactly on his last remark. Was he asking me to go next, or?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite hear, so I was not sure. Yeah. So you're asking me to speak more about sovereignty itself, right? Or, yeah. Okay, great. I mean, I think one of the things that I'd really stress here is, and this is really, I mean, it gets back to when we get to the question of sovereignty. I think what I would really like to stress is from a different perspective from Shruti's, but analogous, right? Because I think for me, part of the work that the concept of the impossible does is activate in a particular direction the idea of potentiality, right? That is to say, but what is interesting about pairing possible and impossible together, as distinct from, say, pairing possible and actual together, is that, when you pair possible and actual together, you are making the possible bear the brunt of the future. When you pair possible and possible and impossible together, you are recognizing the possibility of multiple futures, right? Of different kinds of futures. That is to say, potentiality can be about sovereignty, or potentiality can be about an absence of sovereignty, or a relinquishment of sovereignty, more correctly put, right? And what the word impossible for me activates is the emphasis on a potentiality of non-sovereignty. And that's what I find especially powerful in Daniel's book. Indeed, for Daniel, these four thinkers are thinkers of the impossible, right? That's one of the things I found interesting and powerful about the book, right? And I want to stress, I mean, I think I'd be doing Daniel a disservice, I'd be doing all of these thinkers a disservice. We all know that they're not only thinkers of the impossible, right? That's not my claim at all, right? That would be a ridiculous claim to make. But what Daniel is teasing out is them as thinkers of the possible. And to get a sense of what is at stake in this, I think it's important to contrast possible and impossible a bit more. To say that something is possible is to be able to both define it as an end or a goal, and also to at least dimly see a path to an end or a goal, to that goal. So it's to define both an end and a potential means, right? To say that this is why I might say the language of the possible is organized in terms of sovereignty. To say that something is impossible is to say that one or both of two things, that we see no path or means to the end, and that we have only the dimmest apprehension or intimation of what the end itself is, right? And that's why I think when one uses the term impossible, one is in a particular rendering of sovereignty, which could be called the relinquishment of sovereignty. Now, why does the impossible matter? I think the impossible matters because it belongs to the same conceptual sphere as the minor. To my mind, it matters because it is the most intensely ethical moment. It's actually the moment when ethics is transmuted into religion, but I'll not go into that. Speaking of religion here, I should add, not in the modern disciplinary sense, but in the sense that Ambedkar and Gandhi, by very different paths, come to that term, right? Very broadly speaking, at least, ethics in its modern iteration lays claim to a certain universality and reason to critique in the Kantian sense. Relatedly, it's concerned with the possible, right? This ethics is exemplified in the Kantian categorical imperative, one may say, right? Which is the imperative to treat others never merely as a means to an end, but also as ends in themselves. And instituting an ethical order requires an entire institutional apparatus, right, that draws on both public reason and expertise. This apparatus that we describe as secular democracy. And I value secular democracy far, far too much to say that, I want to get rid of it, right? But at the same time, this is not what impossibility is about. Of course, there is a certain impossibility to ethics too, right? Nobody's ever going to ever realize the categorical imperative in all of their relations. But that impossibility is what we usually describe with the term idealism, right? To be an idealist is to seek an ethical goal and to recognize that its possibility lies not in the present, but in the future, and to try and organize society and life so as to achieve that future. Right? So that is one sense of the possible. However, the focus of today's event, as we look at the title, as also of Daniel's book, is not on this impossibility internal to the concept of the possible, but the concept of the impossible itself. Right? That is, I think we have to distinguish between a possibility and an impossibility internal to the concept of the possible and the concept of the impossible. Right? The concept of the impossible as an ethical and social orientation. And I think it's, following Derrida, one should ideally call it a quasi-concept, right? And I just want to note very quickly two ways in which this politics of the impossible manifests itself in Daniel's book. One is what he describes as the concern with inconsequence, right? Thus, for example, Bhagat Singh is asking for books to read even as he's preparing for the gallows. Reading when preparing for death cannot be a striving for mastery. There is a certain inconsequential, and inconsequential obviously means that you don't know what the end is, right? Consequence, end, etc. There's a certain inconsequential reading going on here, which Daniel beautifully hints at. Relatedly, there's also relinquishment of sovereignty, which Daniel focuses on in Gandhi, but I'll not dwell on that because I think it's already Daniel does a great job of that, and I recommend that you read. I mean, for those of you in the webinar, I'd recommend that you read the books and get to that. But here, I just want to raise three questions for Daniel in turn, as we that I'd like you to respond to, Daniel. The first question is this: all the four figures you mentioned are concerned not just with impossibility, but with possibility, right? Possibility in the idealistic sense, possibility in the actual sense, in both these senses, right? The constitution which who's writing Ambedkar led, is an exercise in the politics of the possible. That's what the Constituent Assembly is, right? The Congress was engaged all the time in calculating the possibilities that would allow it to come to power and retain power, right, etc., etc. So my question, very simply put, is what is the relationship between the impossible and the politics of the possible? How do we think consequence and inconsequence together? Right? This is an issue you touch on in passing, but I did feel that you did not dwell on it enough, right? And, for example, when Gandhi says, please consider me foolish, this does not mean please ignore me. When he's going on a salt march, he's not saying, please ignore me. He's saying, please respond to me. And I'm going to make sure that you respond to me, right? So even if I consider you foolish, I must respond to you. So that demand for a response is somewhere there. Foolishness itself, in some senses, underwrites a politics of impossibility. So it'd be great to hear you reflect a bit more on this. The second question I have is this, and it's related to the first one. It is, should we make a distinction between authority and power? As you know, authority is not quite the same as power. If you have power over me, it is something that you can exercise punitively. Right? But what is striking about authority is that it stands apart from you and me. Right? You have authority over me when I respect you despite your not being able to punish me, or when I defer to you despite your not being able to punish me, right? Authority in this sense is about a certain acknowledgement of the rightness of power, right? And that's what makes the word authority so powerful in a way. Yeah. Right, that, that's why it's possible also to have power without authority. You think of a tyrant, right? And it's somebody like Gandhi or Ambedkar or Bhagat Singh. At various times in their life, they have authority without power. Yeah. And that too is very, very important. So I think it's very important to make a distinction between these two, right? So that's something I'd like you to think a bit more about. And the third question is this, each of these four thinkers, Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar, Gandhi, are in tension with each other. Right? They are disagreeing, especially Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar, Gandhi. They are hardly, they are in pretty, antagonistic relations often with each other, right? And one thing you do not do in this book is explore what this antagonism means. Really, what you have are four politics of the impossible, right? So what I'd like to ask you to do is, what does it mean to put these four politics of the impossible in conversation with any of them, with each other? Right? I'll stop here. Sorry, I've gone on too long already, but yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Beginning with Shruti's provocation, I think the challenge to think all of these terms together, and I was going to simply give the list. So possibility, impossibility, possibility as potentiality, the actual and the actualized, and towards the end of Shruti, you mentioned also the phantasmatic, or the fantastic, I should say. And I think how one thinks about these terms together, because one must, and these four figures did, I think is worth pressing on. And so one way that I might kind of tentatively put it would be to say that these are four figures who are in no uncertain terms making demands for actualizable politics, for possible politics, for even as Ambedkar is watching Congress Party chip away at the most amazing constitution that he's written, only to kind of have it be something totally unrecognizable. Ambedkar is still thinking about the actualizable and the possible. And for me, I think this is not, I say kind of briefly, as you said, I don't think this is a paradox. I think one has to imagine a certain type of anti-colonialism, a certain type of minoritarian question, a certain type of Black fugitivity question. And this is kind of the drawing on the triangle that Shruti you gave, that has anti-colonialism as a one point. And so the question then becomes how to think them at the same time. And I think this is precisely what it seems like Ambedkar is the perfect figure for this, right? So Ambedkar is simultaneously imagining a very actualizable and possible state, which has a constitution, which has institutions that protect the Dalits, and which can be put into place in advance, perhaps, of a society which is yet to eradicate caste. That is the possible, that is the fantastic, that is the potential, right, of Ambedkar's writing of the Constitution. At the same time, one has to imagine something much more than that, and that thing, that utopia, where caste is actually annihilated, is something that is despite even the possible things that Ambedkar could do, is never going to exist in Ambedkar's life. And I think there's a realization of this, right? Certainly by 51, certainly by 56, the Ambedkar knows that he will not see the end of caste in his lifetime, even though he's perhaps tried to put into place a number of different things that might get towards that goal. And so how do you make a demand against injustice in the meantime is a politics of the possible while also recognizing a certain type of demand for a kind of truly anti-caste, truly post-colonial world that is almost guaranteed not to exist in your life. And I think moving between these two is the kind of negotiation that all four figures, I think, actually do, and including, and even to add Fanon in. Fanon is someone who's thinking about a politics of the possible meantime, a politics of the actualizable or the potentiality, and politics of the impossible, which lies beyond the abyss that we will never be able to cross, as far as he can see. Shruti,
I wanted to come in very briefly, but I mean, just to kind of rev it up a little bit, just to say that when I mean this, I'm very aware. I'm not sure about Bhagat Singh. I'll put him on one side here, but the other three are, and certainly other figures that I've been interested in, have already taken, I don't use the word, it's truly post-colonial in the sense that they're imagining a life and politics without empire in it. So that's why it's not anti-colonial. It is deeply futuristic in that sense. And post-colonial, because the principles of this period, principal political actors, thinkers, however you want to call them, they have already imagining a world without the empire. And this is where I think I have my hesitation with someone like Fanon. And there might be reasons for it for different contexts, because some of that politics is very hidebound still in the imperial relationship. And in fact, thinking that, how is an exit possible? If at all, then exit is possible. The answer is probably no in a Fanonian world, that the exit is not possible. So I find these people very interesting precisely because they are at the height in their actual concrete lives, looking at the height of a very strong imperial state and imperial politics, draconian even, imperial politics, yet their imagination is entirely without the empire. And that I think they're already imagining a future where they don't exist. So I think that's what I meant in terms of potentiality, the work of possible and actual, because I quite agree that they are thinking about all operable concepts, not in an instrumental way, but in the kind of what can be operable and cannot be operable. And so I think that's why I think the life and death question becomes interesting, because it posits a sovereignty as around questions of sacrifice. And I'm not alone in saying that. Many other people, including Ajay, Faisal, have written about it. But I think what sacrificial politics does is that it also positions the question of politics in relation to ethics as opposed to the law or juridical life. So the power authority, I'm just trying to kind of address the power authority question that Ajay is trying to allude to. But all of these people, again, I don't put Bhagat Singh in this. I'm not sure why, partly because, another time. But I think, having said that, they're all very willfully also trying to create a set of political norms. It's not simply, they want, Ardayar, I'm not sure whether he's interested in creating new political norms. He's really interested in opening things up, as I said, whereas certainly Gandhi and Ambedkar are, and even actually Savarkar, if you put Savarkar into it, and kind of a different kind of character into it, they are interested in creating a new political, a new sense of the political. There's no other way to put it. And the question, therefore, for me, and my hesitation again on the minor, this is, of course, a world which is imagined through the minor, through, as it were, deep, disempowerment and the like. But this is a world which has produced, this would be my contention, that it has produced a new set of political vocabularies. It will be our task as academics today, or whatever, whether we are political theorists, philosophers, literary persons, however we want to call it, to actually reconstitute the work they have done in their to now use a very terrible word, in the canonical capacity of their work. Okay, so it's the opposite of saying this is a subaltern work. I'm actually making a different argument, that this is a non-subaltern, highly powerful set of political thinking, which comes from the place of the minor, but will not fold into that. And it is our duty to see, in some ways, our project could be to not simply see them in the disempowerment category or necessarily, but how absolutely a new set of canonical precepts have been put into place, are operable, and we are actually just the first drafters of it, looking at it. And so for want of a better word, to be very crass, because now I do a lot of journalism, these people are, they are the Kants, the Hegels, and, of the 20th century. It's, in their own way, and much more political. And therefore, how do we reconstitute them as philosophers, and not just as actors? That, I think, is something that interests me deeply, which might not interest you, but it certainly interests me, because I think that will become a usable set of concepts. And then the final point, since this is about literature, minor, West, East, the question is whether this, I'm not bothered about whether some canonical world I sit in Cambridge is going to recognize this as political thought or not, right? But the question is going to be how urgently this work is understood to be of canonical capacity. That is going to be also interesting for our lifetime. That whether, it's not simply that, whether political science departments are now going to teach Gandhi as a philosopher or not. That's a debate that people might want to have on decolonizing curriculums. I'm actually saying that something much bigger has happened here, And so I find it very enormous and interesting world that we are in with this, of which we are only beginning to kind of open up and see. And these kinds of books like yours are absolutely essential to this project. So I'll just congratulate you here and say that, it's great, but my difficulty would be that this is, my caution would be, I don't have a question, it's a positionality that we perhaps don't share, that I don't see this as a defeated politics. I think it has been incredibly productive, powerful, has created new political norms. One could say Ambedkar is not simply because of the Constitution, but the way in which various other ways we can think about, he has given the political grammar to the world's largest democracy. Have we even thought about what it means to be living in his political world? We tend to think of him, he lost, but actually I tend to think he really won. And in lots of ways, he really won. I'm not saying all the emancipatory stuff came to be true, but the way in which some of the politics, Gandhian politics, was steered out, the anti-statist politics was shared out, and republicanism wins. It's not the Constitution that wins, it's republicanism that wins. And I would say that Ambedkar is its architect. And so there are very many ways to which we can go through with this, but of course time is running out, and I can see Namrata has showed up to say, yeah, I wanted to kind of bring the power authority, East, West, minor, powerful, where do we situate these people, and our positions might not be the same.
I think very, very quickly, as before we take a question, I think now I see that the disciplinary difference come into play. Because post-colonial studies leads you into this belief that historians and literature people are all in it together, and at some point there is a break. And I think the break actually here is comparative literature. And comparative literature is a study that begins with the premise that you cannot read every book. And so it is a discipline of impossibility, and what you do with that, right, is you read as many books as possible, and you read as many books as possible with other people. I think this is a kind of key foundational disciplinary argument, with the perpetual realization that what you are doing is only beginning to start what Auerbach calls the beginning points for someone else to finish the project, or for someone else to take on the project that you could not yourself finish.
Mhm.
And so the very kind of makeup of comparative literature is an impossible project, which is about kind of just maybe tentatively setting down starting points for someone to pick up after you're gone, and to read books that you have read, but also to read more books than you were able to read. And so, I mean, this is the kind of impossible project, which still nevertheless imagines that someone will hopefully come along and carry that starting point that you laid down one step further. And so there is a future imagined, but it's a future that we can only be sort of 10 books into that before our time is up. And we have to pass it. There's a question of finitude, not life or death. I think it's a question of finitude that really pushes them. We should open up to questions from the audience.
Yes. Thank you for that. That's such an invigorating discussion. And I think the last point that you were making, there is a question from one of our audience members that ties in somewhat to the point you were making right now. And he asks, I'm wondering if Dr. Ilham might have more thoughts from a literary critical view on minor literature, which often takes shape from a regional/ethnic archive. Now, how does this fit within or undo the sticky paradigm of world literature in the field of the global Anglophone in particular?
There's a number of things to unpack. The global Anglophone being a sort of bizarre academic job market term that hasn't quite figured out what it means. World literature is still very much in flux, from Goethe to Auerbach and so on. And then the kind of Deleuzian sense of Kafka being this minor writer, a Jewish writer, writing in German in Prague. And I think the minor is both minoritarian in some sort of identity sense. But I think what even the Deleuze argument, when it's at its best and doesn't collapse in on Deleuzianism, is thinking about where the minor escapes to. So it's not simply that the minor is a form of like politics that is rooted in an identity, that is rooted in a language, but it's a type of writing that imagines perpetual escape, that imagines a world that is beyond the world that one knows, and that imagines that world contains something that we don't know. So again, in that sense, in a very kind of, if we kind of take that kind of very, very, very modified Deleuze that I've just given you, then we can see that I would put him in that same genealogy of critique of Benjamin, of Auerbach, of Fanon, who is these are thinkers who are constantly trying to use critique to imagine a way out, to imagine an escape, to imagine a world that could be otherwise. This is the line from Adorno in late 1960s, right before his death, which is to commit to something is a critique about a world that should be otherwise. And the minor then becomes a way of writing that imagines the escape to that world, even though we might not know what that world is. And the scale of that world is always necessarily the world, and so world literature then becomes the category that the minor might be able to take on more actively than any other kind of form of writing or other form of literature. As far as Anglophone, it's anybody's guess. But,
Fair. Thank you for that. That was a question from Arnav Adhikari. We have another question from Abhin Chakraborty, who asks, how does the politics of Bhagat Singh and his brand of socialism remain relevant in the context of today's politics, especially in the wake of the decline of the political left?
This goes back to something that I think Shruti really identified quite well in the analysis case of Hardayal, which is that these thinkers, despite all of our desires to kind of place them within a particular political lineage, were much messier and therefore much more provocative and therefore much more promiscuous and therefore much more utopian thinkers than a single lineage could possibly describe. And so, yes, Bhagat Singh, undoubtedly, there are strains of socialism in Bhagat Singh. There are strains of communism and Marxism, of anarchism. All of these things are present in someone like Ambedkar's writing. Someone like Bhagat Singh's writing. He's also someone who was 23 when he was hanged. And so these are ideas. I mean, and well, when I was 23, I hadn't formed any ideas. Bhagat Singh seems to have formed a few more than I did. But nevertheless, I mean, these are ideas that are still very much in flux at that moment of the writing. And I think the notion that one can kind of commit promiscuously to a set of politics that is utopian without restraining oneself to a particular strain of thought or of kind of a genealogy of politics is what Bhagat Singh offers us now. One can imagine a politics of sort of a hodgepodge politics made up of socialism and Marxism and communism and anarchism that imagines the world that isn't simply pre-described by any of these terms, and yet motivated perhaps by all of them. Thank you. That was a fantastic. I also thought about Ajay and Shruti.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to this that if I may, that, one of the interesting things, I don't know Bhagat Singh per se, but because Bhagat Singh is more declaratory and has kind of attached himself to certain forms of commitments, to certain political vocabularies, established vocabularies. But it's his life story, which, say, Chris Moffat would say, becomes such a kind of hauntology. It haunts, it incites people into political action. That's what it does. And that is why the Aam Aadmi Party can use it, the BJP can use it, any number. It's kind of, so it's not that he was actually the least, he was the most clear that he did belong to the world of communism, right? I mean, he is very clear in his own, more or less, like in a way that, say, Hardayal will not be able, you will not be able to even, though there are these temptations, as I said, to kind of fold these people back into Marxism, communism, nationalism, anarchism. Hardayal is actually very disruptive, and that's really, the work of the Gadar is truly true to its kind of word. It's disruptive, it's treasonous, it's chaotic, and then it leads, but what it does is it leaves residues from nationalism to communism in all of them. It leaves a very big trace, a disjointed trace in the 20th century. Bhagat Singh is not like that. I mean, Bhagat Singh's potentiality is actually his death and the sacrificial politics. And then that becomes an incitement to politics, and then, can be revered by the nationalists and statists, but also, as I said, or any number of people, because it becomes like an invocatory spirit to do something.
I mean, I think if you'll allow me to be a pretend historian for a second, this is a moment where these terms are themselves not entirely clear. I mean, this goes back to Ajay's claim about religion. Right? Gandhi's religion, Ambedkar's religion, Navayana Buddhism, the kind of bizarre idiosyncratic recuperation of the Bhagavad Gita. These attempts at religion, are themselves trying to think through the definition of religion at a moment where it is itself up for grabs. And Gandhi is someone who can grab religion and make it political. Ambedkar is trying to do the same, but in a completely different vein. And even Bhagat Singh is someone whose essay, Why I Am an Atheist, is someone who is trying to think about religion without thinking about theology or transcendence. And so you see, even in this moment, the concepts of religion, of socialism, of communism, none of these have even been settled yet. This is fresh off of 1917. This is fresh off of World War I. These are concepts that are still being sorted out, even in themselves, let alone in each individual thinker's work. I think going back to that moment of messiness, I think, is a really important way of capturing what makes all of these four thinkers so provocative. As we're
I'll
watching.
disagree with you here. I'll disagree with you here that while these are not settled categories in the way we may receive them 100 years later, I don't think it's simply about the messiness of their ideologies, is my point. I do think that they are incredibly, if I'm allowed to be a bit bold, I think they're actually very clear in lots of ways. So there's a way of sort of negating saying like, okay, it's not simply like Gandhi is saying, I'm not a liberal. He's not simply saying that. He's doing much more than that. He's destroying those tenets and put some other tenets in place, which cannot be then captured by the given political currencies of the day and indeed of today. So that's a different kind of argument to say that there is an open play of ideologies at this point, that some kind of marketplace or even some sort of settlement, or I don't know, that's how people look at a lot of these ideologies, that there's a way in which the contingencies will settle them. But I'm actually not making that point at all. I'm making the point that these people are fully aware. They write in the full awareness of, say, someone like Ambedkar has written in the full awareness of Marxism and French revolutionary thinking and Nazism, right? Or say even a Tilak has written in the full awareness of, Kantianism and neo-Kantianism and evolutionary thinking, late 19th century stuff, whatever the inheritance is. So I think that's to get at the prevailing political currencies. Having said that, I think I'm in agreement with Ajay, particularly on religion, which I have also used his discussion for my chapter on Gandhi in my book, that actually that for someone like Gandhi, and he's quite exceptional here, I don't know how that works with Ambedkar, that he actually doesn't just embrace religion. He is actually saying this is our biggest inheritance. It's a bit like what, as psychoanalysts would say, humans are marked by the exception, by the fact that they're already born into language, right? So run with that, this is your imprisoned house, or this is what you have, basically. And in a way, Gandhi is doing the same with religion, that this is your inheritance, and this is, you can't exit out of it. And which is quite different from the way in which, I think, in my view, it works for Ambedkar. It's not that kind of surrender, as it were, to God. So I think these are really interesting discussions, whereas I think I will maintain that someone like Bhagat Singh's power, is in the apotheosis of that death politics, in the 30s, that, Hardayal has started, Dhingra, there are many people. But he has also committed himself not just to the nation. It's not simply a debt for Mother India, which is what other debts had been. And so it is an opening in a different way. But I think the question was about Bhagat Singh. So I find his resonance is because of that. And you know better because you've done very well with his reading and the way he's been written and stuff. But I would be hesitant to fold him back into anything too much of a straitjacket, despite his commitments to those words, because his ultimate power is his hanging.
And I think to as I'm saying, no socialism, no communism, no Marxism, and then the term that I'm clearly sneaking in through the back door is egalitarianism, and that's the word that I associate with all four of these thinkers. Although, as Ajay pointed out, that word is in tension as it moves across the thinking of four men who are not in agreement with one another, to put it very lightly, and so. I think, right, in some ways I agree with you. There are groundings from which these men are writing, and writing very confidently, and writing in a very confident tradition, and knowing that. But I think while that is also true, I think I want to foreground in the meantime this kind of tentativeness and this kind of promiscuity of thought that runs alongside and parallel to these more dominant modes of identifiable politics.
Thank you. This is the last question we're going to take today. And this is from Deepa Koriseri, who says, thank you very much for this very exciting conversation. And I found the idea of impossibility that you engage with in relation to this anti-colonial thinking very interesting. She asks if you have looked at how the modern Indian subject responds to this tradition when the academic world is engaging with the post-colonial imaginary, but national politics is deeply atavistic or conservative.
This is an open question, and a question actually I would love to know the answer to, or have a glimpse at the answer of. I might defer actually to the introduction that Pratima Banerjee wrote to the Orient Black Swan edition of the book, which is just an incredibly beautiful piece of writing. But it's one where she thinks through the difference between impossibility and nationalism, the difference between anti-colonialism as an impossible project and nationalism. And at a moment, right, precisely at a moment where nationalism does seem to be the dominant mode of politics and the most xenophobic and kind of frightening in ways. And I think a kind of recovery, I don't like the word recuperation, but a kind of return to anti-colonialism beyond nationalism and as anti-authoritarianism, which is endlessly open, which is kind of completely opposed to xenophobia, xenophilic, is the kind of the politics that I would like to see in opposition precisely to the dominant mode of nationalism that seems to not simply be the case in South Asia, but around the world right now. Turn on your mic though.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just had a tiny remark. I wish there was time to go into all the wonderful remarks that Shruti was making, for example, about republicanism, about the distinction between the actual and the possible, and some of the other remarks that she was making later also. But maybe one way of getting to some of those takes is also by returning to this question that you asked, Deepa, which is to say that, I do not think that the impossible is necessarily about giving up on the actual. The impossible is about another path to the actual. And one way of describing that path is to say that, look, the impossible is that path to the actual which is at work whenever you have what Daniel was just calling an anti-authoritarian politics. And I think that word anti-authoritarian is very important, because authoritarianism as a concept emerges, not as a concept, authoritarianism as a form of being, as a form of action, emerges precisely when power lacks authority. Right? So I think it's very important to distinguish authority and authoritarianism. Right? It is when power lacks authority that authoritarianism becomes unavoidable. And in that context, I think all the anti-authoritarian movements that are taking place all over India, here too, and everywhere, is part of what I would call the engagement with the impossible as distinct from nationalist politics, which by its very nature is kind of very, very atavistic and conservative, to use the word that you used. Again, I want to stress that it's not as though every invocation of the nation is atavistic and conservative. One of the reasons that I find, say, both Ambedkar and Gandhi fascinating is that they both invoke the nation, right? But they do it in the name of the minor, so to speak. So there is certainly I'm not saying that, a politics of the impossible gives up on the nation, but I am saying that, a politics of the impossible gives up on the kind of nationalism that seeks a sovereign. So,
and I think there's a kind of key difference between impossibilism and despair. Impossibilism is not despair, but it is also not idealism. it avoids the trappings of idealism and it avoids the trappings of despair. It is something that kind of navigates a different path on behalf of this post-colonial world, which may or may not include nations, which may or may not include all sorts of things, none of which we can know, but on whose behalf we must act, rather than sit back and
Shruti, you look like
I don't agree. So with that Daniel's point, Vicky, but I think I liked the comments. But I would like to say that we haven't had the chance. But I think Ajay also mentioned this earlier in response to your book that when you see these figures in relation to their antagonisms, to the figures that they have also provoked antagonistic thinking, say Savarkar for a start, or Gandhi Savarkar, the essential psychic and political duality of India. It's not actually Gandhi Ambedkar, I would argue. It's actually Gandhi Savarkar, and that's really still being played out. It's not simply about authority and authoritarianism. And for me, very telegraphically, this is not just simply to plug my own work, but I think therefore the central question does become violence. How do you think about this? Because it's an essential political question, which is not simply about sovereignty, but it is again an individual capacity we kill. It's not simply, and so it's this kind of, so violence becomes to me the kind of pivot on which much rests in terms of also the story around other forms of thinking, like Savarkar's or Patel's even, or many other people or even someone like Tilak. And so this is a very important big force field, and which is not, as I said, far from exhausted. And I don't refer to the national question precisely because I agree with Ajay that, that in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be something, it exists not simply because it exists, but I think for me, the interesting story is the conversion of this project into republicanism, into a republican democracy. And that cannot be exhausted by the national question. And in fact, one of the way we are seeing the fights and the contest in India is around, as it were, an idea of nationalism, and I'm not just saying Hindutva, but nationalism versus republicanism. And I think these are ways in which those debates are going to be, that would be my take. And, it's a much more normative, political, theoretical take rather than a wonderful...
Namrata, if there is, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yes.
Namrata, if there is time, could I ask Shruti to speak a bit more about republicanism? I'd be very curious to hear more.
So just one line, you'll have to read my book, Ajay. You'll have to read my book, so it's coming soon. So the thing is, in very simply put, this question of sovereignty, which we have discussed in terms of, life, death politics, individual subjectivity, that you see in the early, particularly, and I don't mean to just speak in a time period sense, but the work of a figure like Ambedkar, in my view, would be how to also produce the category of the people. And what does and so that's really a transition in one line that takes place during the Civil War of 47. So it is not a category that exists prior, is my view, that it is the moment of revelation of the people. And after that, you can call it the Republic, you can call it whatever, but the people have really appeared on the horizon as the subject of the political in Civil War in 47. So that's the book there. So you would laugh, but that's really what I really have tried to argue, that because the people are the bedrock of the unit of democracy.
Yes.
And in India, because of you can't cut off the head of the king. There is no head of the king to be cut because of Brahmanism. So it's just dispersed. So where is republicanism going to come from? Mm-hmm. And those are questions, for another time. But they dominate, and this is where I think Gandhi will not become such a marginal figure by when republicanism has also become a very animating, impassioned set of politics in the 40s. It's not merely communalism. It is the deity of the people has risen, so, they have arisen. So, that what do you do, and they're free to kill too, so, so anyhow, so that I think, I find that's why I never lose sight of this project, not simply because I want to put it in the black box of nationalism, that is the oppressive thing here. I find certain forms of nationalism oppressive, but it's a question to be asked also why all anti-imperial politics ended with nationalism and national self-determination. So, but that's, yeah. Open.
That seems like precisely Mbiko's project by turning to fraternity, Maitra, this notion of fellowship, of fraternity, of kinship, as a way of producing a certain type of republic where there cannot be, where the people must recognize themselves as people, as connected, in the context of Pakistan, he uses the phrase organic filaments, are the things that connect people that they must recognize themselves as the people in order to act. The tragedy of Pakistan for him will be that those organic filaments will be too thin.
Let me just say, what I find really fascinating about these people we talk about, and of course one can mock it for being egotistical, narcissistic, or whatever. But when you look at contemporary thinking of communalism at the moment, say Badiou and the rest, or Rancière, or any number of people who are trying to think about kind of post-liberal politics in a more emancipatory way, they always say the project has to start with the subject. It has to be a subject-oriented political. And here is a very, very rich history of subject-oriented political. And that's really, in a way, India is instructive, for, as it were, a futurity of projects, a political project. It's not simply a site of anti-colonialism. It is a sign in my view, it is a sign of a new universal political, whether you acknowledge it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. That was.
I'm sorry to.
Sorry, Namrata.
No, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to have to bring this to a close. What is, I think, a discussion that can go on for hours. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for all our speakers, for your time and for being a part of this. I'd also like to thank all the members of our audience who've tuned in through Zoom and YouTube and have so actively, I think, participated in this discussion as well. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I certainly have. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thank you to Daniel. Thank you to Daniel for writing the book.
And thank you, Namrata, for bringing all this together. Thank you very much. Thank you,
yes,
Ajay.
thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel, for this book and such a wonderful provocation. Thank you, Shruti. Thanks, Namrata. So, yeah, what is a wonderful panel. So,
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yes, good morning.
Bye.
Bye.